Now that Boruto chapter 74 is out and we've gotten some more scenes with Eida and some Leaf Ninja, I think we can discuss some clear weaknesses to Eida's ability to steal your heart, and a potential goofy extra weakness that I'll save for a little later in the video. Now while I've already extensively covered some early ideas for Eida and Daemon's weaknesses in the past, some of which have already been proven true, and I recommend checking that video out after this one if you haven't already, today I'm focusing more so on how to potentially avoid Eida's lovability to begin with, rather than how to defeat her even if you are in love with her. The reason why this is so important is because, as we've seen with a few examples, and it's explained directly from Amado, once you've fallen in love with Eida, the effect doesn't just go away later on if you go into another room from her or something like that. Once you've fallen in love with her, the effect lasts until she dies, according to Amado, which is why Boro didn't kill Eida and Daemon even after he had them locked up in those pods, unless he had ulterior motives behind keeping them around. We also see this directly with Code in chapter 57. Code notices that he can't kill Eida when he tries to after she ignored him. Then when she goes into another room to brush her teeth, Code is still showing signs of being in love with Eida, asking Bug if she was interested in him, and talking about how his heart was pounding the longer he waits, and Bug says Code is ensnared in her spell already. So the effect still lasts even when you're separated from Eida, although you probably won't be blushing and all googly-eyed over her like Konohamaru and Delta anymore if you aren't looking at her, and you might not be as heavily under her influence as you would be if she was right there, but you'll still retain some feelings for her, and you'd still be unable to kill her. I do want to mention, though, that this is all independent of how affected you are by Eida and how in love you are with her, as Code was still in love with Eida even when she was in another room, and he even confesses his love to Eida in chapter 71. But Code still consistently disobeyed Eida's orders when it didn't align with what he wanted to do, for the sake of carrying out Ishiki's will and vengeance against the killers of his god, even when she was in the same room as him. Like when she told Code to stop trying to kill Amado in chapter 71, but Code still goes in for the kill anyway because he was on his retribution list. So Code is actually one of the less effective people we've seen, as other people like Delta and Bug immediately obey all of Eida's orders, and people like Konohamaru just fall down the stairs and get completely knocked out. And as a side note, I hope they further elaborate on why this happens, because Delta is strong, so strength doesn't seem to be the answer. But anyway, even though Code isn't as affected by Eida as some other people, he still retains feelings even when she's not around, and that's true for everybody. Okay, I've harped on this for a while now, so why am I bringing this up?
Seriously? You asked why?
Because even if you aren't super affected by Eida, once you've fallen in love with her, you will never be able to kill her, and you'll never be able to physically hurt her either, which makes fighting and defeating her insanely difficult. At best, you can seal her away like Boro, but you're not going to be able to kill her or even hurt her. So the most effective way to counter Eida is to never be caught under her love spell to begin with. That probably sounds a lot easier said than done, and to an extent it is, but how can you do that?
But how? I don't get it!
It's actually pretty simple. Just don't look at her eyes. We've already seen the signs for this in the past, but chapter 74 made it crystal clear on several occasions. Nobody fell in love with Eida until they saw her eyes. You can make it a little more broad and say it's just a matter of seeing Eida's face, not necessarily her eyes, but there are a couple scenes that indicate to me that it is her eyes specifically that's important, and I'll show you all of those scenes right now. Starting with the opening scene of chapter 74 at the train station. Eida walks out facing forward, and then she turns to the right where Shikamaru, Sai, and the others are walking up to her and can see her eyes as they were wide open. And then they fell in love with Eida. And there are some people behind them also looking at Eida and muttering and blushing. And then she is shown turning her head backwards, and then we see some new people muttering, and so she just flies away. So everyone in that scene saw Eida's eyes first, and then we saw them muttering and blushing. The more important scenes come next though. When Eida is about to land at the house she, Daemon, Boruto, and Kawaki are staying at, she is facing sideways really far away. And Mitsuki and everybody else is looking at her landing, but nobody is affected yet. We see a few shots of them still not affected yet, and we see a shot of Eida with her eyes closed as she lands. Then she opens her eyes, still facing sideways from really far away. And then she turns her head to the left slightly, and her eyes are looking all the way to the left towards everybody. And that's when Inojin and Chocho are shown blushing and clearly in love with Eida. When that happens, we see that Sarada and Shikadai aren't looking at Eida, but instead are looking at Chocho and Inojin, meaning they aren't looking at Eida's eyes. And Shikadai specifically comments on how he couldn't see Eida's face clearly. Then Sarada moves on to noticing Mitsuki's reaction, and then Eida turns away again to head into the building, which is when Sarada turns back to Eida and notices she's going inside. So Sarada and Shikadai are never shown looking at Eida when her eyes were open and facing them in clear sight. But they were definitely shown looking at her when her eyes were closed and she was turned to the side, so they didn't really see her eyes quite yet. Eida was the exact same distance away from them the whole time, so distance clearly wasn't the factor here. And you could argue it's the face because she opened her eyes before she turned her head, but a direct side view is not exactly the best view of a person's eyes, and Eida does not turn her head very much when she turns towards them, but her eyes are shown looking all the way to the left. So her eyes are at a little more exposure than her old face is, and the emphasis on these panels is on her eyes specifically, as we have a shot with her eyes closed, then a shot of her eyes opened, and hardly any of her face at all. It's pretty much just her eyes here, and that's when Chocho, Inojin, and Mitsuki fall in love with her. All the emphasis here is on the eyes, and there's another scene I'll mention later on to coincide with this. When it comes to Konohamaru though, first he sees Eida's legs and isn't shown being affected yet, but once her head and eyes come into view, that's when he starts blushing and going crazy. Same thing with like Shikamaru, back in chapter 69. When Eida is looking at Amado and not Shikamaru, Shikamaru makes no mention of any of his problems. He's just kind of scared because there's a new person who just showed up on Code's team. But then when Eida turns towards Shikamaru and looks at him, he sees her eyes, that's when all of a sudden he starts talking about having a headache and all these problems. And now when we go all the way back to Eida's first introduction at the end of chapter 56, and then her real debut in chapter 57, Eida is shown standing in that pod with her eyes closed. At this time, Code is showing absolutely no signs of affection towards Eida, and he has every intention of killing her if she disobeys him. And he even destroys the pod Eida is in very aggressively. Then she walks right past Code without even looking at him, and so they probably didn't make eye contact, and Code is pretty mad at her for ignoring him, and he threatens to kill her. And then Eida turns her head and eyes towards Code, and that's when we see him noticeably under her effect, as he can't kill her, and then he starts to get more and more flirty with her later on. The key point was that Eida's face was in clear view inside that pod, but Code had absolutely no signs of effect yet. And I'm going to bring this up again later on, by the way, so keep the scene in mind. But then Eida specifically turns towards Code with her eyes open, before she starts to turn away again and grins and says, "Go ahead and try." He was already exposed to her eyes at that point, so she no longer has to look at him anymore. Seeing her eyes or eye contact might be the key here, and this makes a lot of sense in my opinion given what we've been told and shown about Amado's eyes in the past, as iris recognition was needed for Amado to remove Code's limiters. It seems to be what was going on when Amado shut down Delta, and Amado's glasses turned into a projector in response to Amado's eyes back in chapter 45. So we've seen Amado use iris recognition for cyborg abilities before, so it makes sense for it to be at play again here. So Eida actually does have some control over affecting people, as she could technically close her eyes at all times, but that's not a very reasonable solution, so she doesn't really have that much control over it. Before taking things a step further, we can see how if someone knows about all of this in advance, they could implement an effective strategy to fight against Eida and possibly kill her. If you told Might Guy about this, he'd just look at Eida's feet and fight her like he does a Sharingan user to avoid their genjutsu. The exact same strategy would apply here, or a Sage Mode user like Naruto or Kabuto or Mitsuki could close their eyes and just use Sage Mode to sense their opponent. Just like Kabuto did against Sasuke and Itachi to avoid their genjutsu, and how Naruto fought the animal path of pain inside a toad's mouth, where both he and the animal path couldn't see anything, but Naruto could still fight due to his heightened sensory abilities. As long as Shikamaru or Sarada or Shikadai, or somebody anyway, can figure this out before Naruto ever meets Eida for the first time, Naruto could always close his eyes and be in Sage Mode when around Eida, and he might be able to avoid ever falling in love with her as a precaution against her. But now I want to talk about the other possible mechanisms for prevention. And they're kind of hilariously goofy to me, but there's actually some evidence to point in this direction. Remember the scene I mentioned earlier about how Code, who wasn't really affected by Eida when she was in the pod? Keep it in mind for a second. Now I want you to think about Amado. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed that Amado has never really seemed like he was actually in love with Eida at all, even though he says to Shikamaru, "You, Delta, me. No one can escape this ability of hers." As we all know, Amado has a bad habit of always leaving out important information whenever it benefits him. And he literally lied in this panel because he reveals later on in the next chapter that he purposefully left out the fact that there are exceptions to who Eida can entrap, those being blood relatives in Otsutsuki. But who's to say there isn't another way to avoid being caught under her spell? It wouldn't be the first time he withheld something like that after all, and it wouldn't necessarily be an unstoppable solution or a type of person per se, like being an Otsutsuki is. And so it's not like fully a lie, it's just a decent amount of hiding the truth again. We also just established that not looking at Eida's eyes seems like a reasonable option to avoid it, so maybe there's a fourth way to avoid it. Now I know technically Amado could just be more like Shikamaru, where he doesn't really show signs of being in love with Eida, he just can't kill her and gets the headache when he tries kind of thing. But let's say for a moment, Amado is in fact not under Eida's spell, and he never was to begin with. Why do you think that might be the case? Just having scientific ninja tech eyes alone doesn't seem to work, as Delta still fell in love with Eida. So let's go back to the pod scene with Code, and let's ignore the fact that Eida's eyes are closed for a minute, since, maybe it's not about the eyes, but instead it's just her face. Even if that was the case, Code still didn't seem to be affected yet. Now let's go back to Amado. Just look at Amado for a second. Notice something about Amado that's different from almost every other character in the verse, and specifically every other character who's interacted with Eida up to chapter 69. Here, let me make it more obvious. One of the other characters who wasn't under Eida's spell, but wasn't sure if she saw Eida's face clearly enough or not, has the same thing in common. I've actually had this idea in mind ever since we saw Amado see Eida in chapter 69, plus what happens in chapter 57, but still, can't believe I'm saying this might be an option. But wearing glasses might be the dumbest and most effective tool against Eida. The only two people who've seen Eida that wear glasses are Amado and Sarada, and they are two of the only three to somewhat see her and not be affected, with Amado for sure being right in front of Eida and her eyes. You might need to have a direct line of sight to Eida's eyes with no barriers in between for her ability to work on you, which would then possibly explain why Code wasn't affected when Eida was still in the pod. Although, yeah, you can still argue it's because Eida's eyes were closed in that case, and I do think that is why. But this also makes sense to a certain degree because I think everyone has been wondering why on earth would Amado make an ability for Eida that he had no counter for. That doesn't really make any sense given his cautious character, with all these contingency plans just in case things go wrong, like a shutdown code on Kawaki, for example. So I would honestly expect Amado to have a way out of Eida's ability, that he just hasn't revealed yet because he's waiting until it's convenient for him. But we'll have to wait and see if he does or not. In any case though, once you get entrapped by Eida, there's no going back, so putting glasses on after the fact wouldn't work. But wearing them before you ever meet her might be a solution, and so a form of science would be a counter to another form of science, as Eida's ability was created by Amado, who's a scientist. There's also another possible goofy weakness to her ability. When we go back to the scene with Sarada, Shikadai, and everyone looking at Eida, with how the paneling is done, it isn't 100% clear if Sarada and Shikadai looked at Chocho and Inojin right as Eida turned her eyes towards them, or if they saw Eida do that first, and then they looked at Chocho and Inojin when they started reacting weirdly. Similarly, when Sarada is yelling at Chocho and Inojin, Shikadai is still looking towards Eida, but says he couldn't see her face clearly, and Eida doesn't turn back to the side to head into the apartment until after Shikadai says this. So while Sarada and Shikadai are never shown looking at Eida's eyes, it's not fully clear if they did sort of see them or not. If Sarada saw Eida's eyes, then we already discussed that her glasses might have been what protected her from Eida's ability. But what about Shikadai? Here's an even goofier possible weakness, but it does make sense. As we established, you seem to need to see Eida's eyes to be affected by her, so maybe if your vision just isn't good enough to see Eida's eyes from where you are, you might not get affected by her. Think about it. In real life, a lot of us can't see a person's eyes until they come close enough to us. And for some people, that distance is closer or farther away depending on how good her eyesight is. So maybe Shikadai just doesn't have good enough vision to see Eida's eyes from the distance everyone was at, whereas his teammates did. But if he gets a closer look later on, he'll get affected. And so a great way to show all of this would be for Sarada and Shikadai to stay immune from a distance, but then when they get closer, if Shikadai gets affected but Sarada still doesn't, then we see that glasses work everywhere, but bad vision only works as long as you can't see Eida's eyes from where you are. These are rather goofy weaknesses for sure, but so is Daemon's reflection ability weakness of just needing to touch someone. So I definitely think these weaknesses are on the table for now. And I think it would be great for Sarada and Shikadai to figure this out on their own, or with their teammates, to give them some shine in the manga for once. Either way though, I definitely think seeing her eyes, or at least her face, is crucial to the ability, so if you never look at her eyes, you'll never get affected. And so bad vision might prevent you from seeing Eida's eyes from certain distances, and then glasses might be another solution that could let you see her eyes but still not be affected. But I want to hear what you guys think. Do you agree that you probably need to see Eida's eyes to be caught under her love spell, and so never looking at her eyes, or at least her face, is a great counter to Eida that Naruto should implement? And do you think glasses or bad vision will be another possible counter as well? Or do you think Amado is just more like Shikamaru, and he is affected, but just doesn't really seem like it? Let me know in the comment section below. But that's a wrap on today's video, so thank you guys for watching until the end. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, like the video, and hit the bell icon for notifications. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye.